Oh, hi. We have another good morning for everyone in the room. And for those of you joining us via the web, we want to thank everyone for being with us, sharing the time today. In the room, it's worth noting, we have representatives from the home tube fed consumer community and caregivers. We have tube and syringe manufacturers. We have members of GEDSA, home care company representatives, the clinical community, and the FDA. And we really appreciate, during this busy holiday season, the time it took to get here and share with us today. Everyone in the room and via the web joining us has a sincere interest in learning more, sharing experiences and expertise for the purpose of moving forward to avoid misconnections while preserving tube feeders' safety and quality of life. Time today is precious. Let's take advantage of being together, learn more, explore options, engage in discussions in a positive and productive manner. When speaking, asking questions, sharing comments, please introduce yourself first and wait for a microphone. If emailing questions, email them to metzgerl@mail.amc.edu, and that's indicated on our website for you folks. And let's begin, be respectful and productive, and be thankful for this opportunity to come together.
I want to thank everybody for this morning. I think it was beneficial to everybody to hear how people were using feeding tubes now. And we're going to have a few more people come around and introduce themselves. Just didn't hear, I'm Dr. Lillian Harvey. I'm the moderator. I'm a physician in private practice, deals exclusively with patients with nutritional issues, needs tube feeds.
Hi, my name is Tom Hancock, and I am the Executive Director for GEDSA. Just trying to make sure the presentation, can everybody see that? Yes? I wonder if it's possible to dim maybe this portion of the room a little bit. Okay. So I asked Joan if I could take the opportunity to kind of clarify GEDSA's role, try to answer a few questions, articulate some of the confusing aspects of ISO and the standards process. It is confusing. I am going to potentially weigh a little bit on the convener here as well as one of the chairs of the committee. And I also want to provide to you an example of how, if we treat this time effectively and we all work to provide appropriate feedback and proactive opportunities to look at some of the challenges that we have, good things can happen. So I want to share an example of that just happened pretty much over the summer. And so anyway, thank you for allowing me the time. I also want to thank you guys for all of you for taking time out of your precious day to be here, to travel here, to whether on the patient side you're expressing your concerns and frustrations, and on the manufacturer side if you're listening to try to address these concerns, and folks in the middle, the kind of the clinicians that are just trying to do the right thing for patient safety. So anyway, I'm going to jump in, and I'll try to be brief. If the moderator or Joan would like to just give the rip sign, just let me know when it's too much time. But GEDSA's mission is to promote initiatives surrounding safe and optimal delivery of enteral feeding and connectivity. We were formed 2 years ago officially. We were working, I guess, unofficially as an industry group well before that. All with the focus on patient safety and bringing a solution to address the issue of tubing misconnections. This is the updated slide of the manufacturers that are part of GEDSA. They're GEDSA members. Some of the names might be very familiar to you, and others may be foreign to you, I guess pun intended, because they may not operate in the U.S., but they have businesses elsewhere. The point of sharing this slide is a couple of reasons. One is that is a global effort, and you have representation of manufacturers globally on the slide. The second thing is that I might mention this a couple times, but this standard that we're wrestling with today is a voluntary standard. It is one that is advised, is suggested. There are FDA recognition, there are legislation kind of swirling around, but ultimately it is a voluntary standard that manufacturers have to determine if it's important to them. And signing up for GEDSA essentially means you're signing up for this patient safety initiative, and you are supportive of the direction that we're headed in terms of ENFit. And the reason why groups have decided to work together is you have an enteral feeding system that you have multiple components in order to make it function effectively. So manufacturers may focus in one area but not the other. And if these things can't connect to each other, then that obviously is a big problem. And a much bigger problem than tubing misconnection, because you're talking about deprivation of therapy. I also share this slide. I jokingly say this is our alphabet soup of supporters. The list is actually broader than that, but these are supporting organizations that stand behind GEDSA and our mission, and support us in both providing advice and guidance, as well as sharing information and communicating out to their members. And certainly Oley has been a great supporting organization from the beginning. Learning objectives that I'd like to provide is address questions concerning ENFit, provide an update on dose accuracy. I know that was something that was just brought up in the end. And learn how existing challenges to feeding blenderized diets as an input for future innovation. And the reason I put it that way is that I heard this morning some of the frustrations, even with what the system looks like today. And a better solution may fall within the standard and ENFit, and it may not. And what manufacturers need to hear is some of the challenges and frustrations of what exists today, so they can try to solve that problem for you. And I'm confident that we have some really, really bright and sharp people in the room that are listening intently on some of the challenges to come up with better solutions. So first, an update or a background on tubing misconnections. Circumstances where misconnections can occur, there's all kinds of reasons. Low lighting, multiple devices, time pressure, moving a patient from one setting to another. The core issue, though, is actually in the center, and that's the white circle, and that is that there are physically compatible connectors today. So you can take an enteral feeding line today and connect it to someone's vein, and you could cause instant death. There are multiple examples that I want to share briefly as a reminder as to why we're doing this. So an example, IV tubing misconnected to a nasal cannula used to deliver oxygen. The patient suffered after being treated for congestive heart failure. We have a feeding tube to a tracheostomy tube that resulted in a patient death. We have an epidural infusion set connected to a peripheral IV line that has resulted in a patient death. We have feeding tubes connected to an inline ventilator suction catheter, resulting in a patient death. A heparin lock connected to an automatic blood pressure cuff, causing death. And perhaps the ugliest story that we've heard in the past. A feeding tube is coupled with a peripheral line of a pregnant woman, and neither the expectant mom nor the 35-week-old fetus made it. I just actually learned that the nurse that was managing this patient tried to commit suicide as a result of this action. And what I heard was the reason why she tried to do so is that she couldn't, in her life, figure out how she did that. But it happened. And that's the thing we're trying to correct. And when these things are physically compatible with each other, and there shouldn't be, that's a problem. You've got a bunch of engineers in the room that recognize that, and they're designing physically incompatible products, connectors that don't compete with that don't connect with each other, and therefore prevent these things from occurring. A lot of things have been attempted: alerts, guidances, educational materials, practice standards, protocols, color coding. All of these have been tried and have failed. The World Health Organization recognized this as a global public issue and requested that ISO look at establishing a standard back in 2006. The Joint Commission issued a Sentinel event alert initiating the ISO standard, driving the California legislation and public outcry for change. And so this is truly an issue that has to be solved, and one that has been in the works literally since for a decade. And talking to many clinicians, I talked to Deborah Simmons again this week. She is a world-renowned expert in tubing misconnections, have analyzed the incidents that have occurred over the years, and has told me, shame on you guys. You guys should have solved this years ago. She appreciates the effort that is going on today to try to get to a solution, but she's frustrated that it's taken us this long. So a little bit about the standard. An ISO standard, and this is true as if you're establishing standards for, as I joke, toaster ovens to medical devices. The standard process is consistent. And it is a global effort involving technical experts, clinical experts, and regulatory standard experts from across the globe. And the ISO standard is the ISO 80369 standard of small bore connectors. This is a really important slide, okay? And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is the initial list that was deemed to be the most important, most pressing set of connectors that need to be addressed within the series. And it's important to recognize that we're actually not completely out of the woods until we solve all of these collectively. Until that time, you may see some examples of where misconnections could occur. But you have a series. The -1, as we call it, is a general set of requirements. There are then a series of requirements within the therapeutic areas. The -2 is for respiratory. The -3 is enteral. We have urological, limb cuff, neuraxial, and intravascular. Intravascular is, the Lure lock is designated as the intravascular connector. And so one way to think about it is that is not changing, and the other connectors are changing around it, so to speak. The requirements are that they are not connectable with others in the series. They are rigid or semi-rigid material. It passes misconnection risk analysis, usability, human factors testing, and it's, of course, not connected with Lure or needleless connector ports. Yes? Yeah, I appreciate that question. The challenge you have is while this is not a common incidence, it is something that does happen, and it can occur. I can't tell you, Sanford, that there are staggering numbers that would tell you that thousands of people have misconnections on a daily basis. That is not the case. But the view is, if we have one patient death because of a misconnection, that's one too many. There's another issue, that is there are no formal ways to document this type of an issue. And that's one of the things that Deborah Simmons recognized, is that you have to dig into the data hard enough to understand where there are true misconnections, and then what was considered to be the cause of that incident. There are also several near misses. So I actually can't quote for you how many have occurred, and that's not the point. The point is, even if there's one, that's one too many.
Is that correct?
Scott, do you want to address this?
Yeah, the downside of any adverse event reporting is that it's not done well. Is it a device error? Was it a medication mistake, a medication error, where they gave the wrong medication? They just happened to not give the wrong drug, but they gave it via the wrong route. Those go into different databases, different organizations filter those differently. There's actually an effort going on right now for a national post-market surveillance to try to get better at doing this. And the only thing we really know is that what we do see represents less than 1%, we figure, of what actually happens too. But again, that's a postulation, right? So there is no accurate way of understanding this. What has been done over the past couple of decades is multiple countries going to organizations like WHO and stating this is an issue, this is a crisis right now, because they are seeing it not just in the ones or hundreds, but in the thousands that it does occur. And as a nurse myself, I worked on a gastric floor, and I saw well over a dozen near misses in a year, very easily, just on my shift, where people would inadvertently hook something up, and it maybe would be caught. In some cases it wasn't, and it required surgical intervention or possible really bad adverse events. And I got to tell you, in my hospital, that wasn't something that got reported up the chain, because that hospital that wasn't the practice at the time. So that's the downside of this, is we don't have those good mechanisms to really get the tangible quantitative data.
We have one of our Oley ambassadors who is a nurse, was a nurse when she had a career. She's now on disability. She called us in support of any initiative to keep people safe who have people with IV lines. She herself managed to misconnect, and the consequences could have been really severe. She injected some medication into her central line, emergency, ambulance, hospital visit, ER visit. She's safe, but she has a huge concern. She doesn't understand how she could do it. It was a mistake, and people make mistakes.
Thanks, Joan. One thing I'd like to provide is a point of clarity. I've seen a lot of sentiment online about this only being a hospital issue and in a hospital setting, and it only happens once in a while. It happens at home. That's a fact. And I recently heard about a home nurse connecting the wrong line to a child's trach, I think it was. And so just to clear the air, it's not something that only happens in hospital settings. It happens at home. And like somebody said earlier, if it happens even once, because it could happen to you. And of course, we don't think we can do it wrong. We've been doing this for years. But if it's dark, whatever, it can happen.
Well, I hear all that, but ENFit in itself still misconnects with trach tubes. That still is a possibility. So if you're having more,
I can speak to that.
Trying to solve.
I can speak to that. That was one that's been a headache, not just for the ENFit, but for every connector actually that's in existence, because the trach itself has its own standard. It's ISO 5356, managed in a different technical committee, led by a different country. But because we all work under a different, the same house, we have worked in collaboration and tried to identify through market analysis what are the ranges of dimensions through the through bore of the trach, to make it simple. And so we have worked and put forth some dimensions. Unfortunately, at the international level, that dimension didn't get accepted because of one comment that came from another country, and that's kind of the downfall sometimes of consensus building. Now, we felt very strongly about the incident that you just described, because that has come up over and over again. It's in this FDA misconnection calendar. It's all over the place. To the tune that we decided as a nation to do a deviation from the international standard and define that dimension, because it was supposed to be in the international standard. It was pulled out. But at the U.S. level, we decided to vote negative on that standard, and we are currently working towards publication of a deviation that would identify the appropriate misconnection that will allow this series to be able to match up and identify, do they have that risk of misconnection? So that's the first step. Has it completed itself yet? No. No more than the actual lure itself, which is an ISO 594 standard, is one of the most ill-defined design standards on the market. There is no definition of the through bore, the length of the male taper. None of those are in the current standard, which is why we see so much variability, not just in misconnection, but even in disconnections, where I'm a nurse. I hook up those things and I give it the gorilla test and I walk away, come back an hour later, and it's disconnected at the table. How did that happen? Lack of definition of some of these connectors has also created other adverse events, which is one of the other things we're hoping to solve in this. To get back, though, what I believe as a nurse, and I said I grew up with the orange step connector that we use for feeding the liquid solutions, which is similar to the slip cath syringes that we see. The reason why I do believe, through my knowledge of how human error occurs and the precipitants of wanting to create a connection with something like a trach or another orifice, is the fact that you have a cone that goes into a hole. And that's typically what we see with our cath tip syringes. You take a cone and put it into a hole, versus if you take like a lure. The reason why you don't see the lure in the trach a lot is because the action to make that connection is a twist function. So the action from a human, if I have that in my hand, I'm thinking I'm going to go in just like I'm going to screw this lid on. I'm not going to just pop it on. I have to actually do an action, and that's my trained human tendency, which is where the design requirements to help reduce the action of making an error, whether it would actually fit in a hole or not, but to actually try to make that fit, that friction fit, would be reduced by the fact that this is a whole different action too. Now, we're learning that creates other issues now in what we had demonstrated earlier. So now we have to take that step back and start filtering. What can we still do to reduce the risks of trachs, feeding tubes, feed going into trachs or other type orifices that would create an adverse event, but still preserve the necessary needs for areas where maybe the risk for misconnection isn't at the level where it has to be addressed at this with this solution that we have in today's world, and we can look at it differently for tomorrow. But how do we still reduce this risk to an acceptable level is the key thing. And so we have to keep that in mind. And the trach is a great example, because I do believe even if we don't define the through bore of the trach, because there's many reasons why that trach didn't have that through bore defined, I still believe we're going to see a massive reduction in those occurrences from happening, simply because the action that we're training people to make sure that they make a connection is very different. And I think that's a very important thing to know, and that's why the standard itself says there's no way in the world we can possibly eliminate misconnection. There's just too many things in the world. You go into it, I'm sure many of the patients here have lived in an ICU for a period of time. You feel like Medusa. You got tubes coming from all over the place. Many of those devices are not standardized. Many of them are proprietary in nature, and that's still going to be there tomorrow. But what we're really trying to get at is the core areas of highest risk to try to reduce it. And that 80-20 rule that you hear of a lot, that's kind of what's being applied here through this risk management operation. So not a perfect solution, but this event here today is going to help us filter in another level of understanding and what can we do to still move forward and make sure that we are not creating an adverse outcome for a subclinical environment or a set of population that we can try to make sure is still being able to preserve their daily functions.
How does this comply with California? How does this comply with California?
How does the trach apply to California?
Comply with the California law.
Well, right now the California law, and I might look to Dave, who's helps coordinate amongst the organization that communicates to the law there. The law itself for California is to make sure that intral doesn't interact, starting January, with vascular access. And then that also then in 12 months later includes the neuraxial applications. Now this is specific into clinical environments too. If you can correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but I believe they're focusing on hospitals and areas that are in that environment more so than in the home environment in terms of how the state law is written. It does not right now address the breathing systems application right now.
It's on?
Barely.
He's got this up.
Is that mic on, John?
Dave, do the head check.
All right, I'm sorry. My voice doesn't always carry very well. But the California law requires non-interconnectability with IV and obligates hospitals not to purchase enteral and epidural devices that can connect with other items, particularly IV, as modified July of 2016 for enteral, January 2017 for epidural. So this execution of ISO 80369-3 does satisfy that law. But you were asking about misconnection events. I had the opportunity to appear in the California legislature when this law was being debated a couple of years ago with a wonderful nurse, I think a member of Oley, and her child, who required all kinds of care, hospitalized all the time. And she expressed very, very strong support for this configuration for a couple of reasons. This allows portability of care while also improving product safety. So when her child had an issue and he was hospitalized frequently, he could go anywhere because of the harmonization of this design and count on being able to connect and feed. But interestingly, just 30 days before I was to appear in California, there was a nurse in San Francisco who made a mistake and connected that orange step connector to an indwelling lure access device, and a compromised patient died. So the intent of this is, certainly we're not trying to inconvenience anyone, but the desire here is to make sure we avoid those types of misconnections that result in calamitous events. One further comment. I was co-chair with a gentleman from Becton Dickinson in the development of 80369-3. And Scott steers the boat, but the rest of us, have worked with him for a number of years. I've been at this for 7. But what this defines is the connector. There are other standards that have to be developed to define the device. So I think many of you are looking at 80369-3 as what the device will be, and it's certainly going to be an element of it, but it's not 100% definitive in defining what that device is going to become. We found not too long back that we had a dose accuracy question that my friend Ben proposed a redesign for. The need for that as a modification to the standard has been recognized, and it's being incorporated into the device standard that's being written to incorporate this design and the dose improvement design. So the work isn't done. There's a lot more to do here.
I think California law says July 1st, 2016, enteral only fits into enteral.
We're starting to get some questions and feedback from the web. I just want to bring in one that's relevant now. We've gotten some questions on, do you have a time frame on when the vote will take place, at least the preliminary vote, and what's the, what kind of things will be coming out of that preliminary vote?
Well, I think first is the relationship of the standard or the standard development process to the issues and the devices really doesn't have a relationship here. The -3 actually has a U.S. provisional standard that's been in publication for about a year now, I believe, and that is the standard that is actually able to satisfy the California state law and has been one of the tools manufacturers have been able to use to incorporate a design into a medical device, even where these medical device standards don't yet exist. Component standards like the lure are incorporated and modified as necessary to meet the performance requirements of the medical device based upon how manufacturers determine their needs are. And that's the common thing. So, I mean, the whole series actually up there, minus -4, which really hasn't begun yet, they're all at FDIS right now, and I would anticipate that we will see votes. Well, I think 2 votes came out already in December, and I think another one will be released, -3, next week, most likely, and then others between early January and February. I mean, but that's an FDIS vote for an ISO standard, which doesn't change a lot of what the discussion here would do, because what we're talking about here is incorporating the thought of this design into a medical device. And what you will find, I guarantee it, from the clinicians and to the patients, I would say, is many of the devices that are going to incorporate this component are going to look a lot different still, even though there's a connector on the end of it. Yeah, I've seen the blood pressure connector, for example, and I've seen it designed so many different ways. It's indiscernible from each other because of the way it needed to be incorporated into the device it was associated with. Some of these are connected into a wall unit. Some of these are connected right up to the patient. And because of that, the profiles change. The outside ribs would change. The color may change based upon its intended uses, not just indications for use. So you have to realize that as a component standard, it's a tool that went through a series of evaluations to help establish a framework to help carry a manufacturer or a standards developer a risk framework to understand what has this accomplished so far. So when I'm doing my design controls and I'm establishing how to build my product, all the things that goes into that activity, this at least points to what was started, and then it kind of leads you into what you need to do now when you start matching these things together.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that answer, a lot of people are very confused what these ISO standards are versus the FDA versus the manufacturing standards. I think it's a very, clear explanation of what the different standards that we're coming up to need. Just a couple more questions. We've got again coming in, and there's more coming in. I'm going to direct this one to Dr. Klang. And the question is, there is the potential for dead space in the syringes. At what point would this become clinically significant, and do you see it as a real issue?
When you're dealing with 1 cc syringes, and the dose is going to be less than 0.25 mLs, in that setting, the amount of dead space that is currently involved, which I believe is about 0.15 ml, in that setting, it would be clinically significant. However, I would recommend to anyone who is administering medication to patients not to use a 1 cc syringe for this type of measurement. You would want, rather, not to use a concentration, rather dilute. Because if anyone who's administering medication, they know that when you start getting down to the low numbers for oral medications, there's more incidence of error. And in that setting, the medication is being prepared at too high a concentration for that application. And try to administer, say, 0.5 ml, so that dilute the medication up to that. In these settings, they're perfectly correct. ISMP pointed this out. There's a morphine concentrate, there's a Joxin liquid, and in those settings, at the concentrations that they're commercially available, they're at risk for having a slight difference in the amount delivered. But you're asking for trouble when you're using too concentrated a product, even with a regular syringe, not just something with ENFit.
And Tom from GEDSA would also like to comment on that.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's appropriate to do now, but the dead space and the dose accuracy was actually essentially a case study of how we can work together to solve a problem. So I don't know if we want to do that now or not. Okay, I think we hit enough on the standards. And this might actually, one of the questions that came up is concerns about medication dosing. Could you prepare to share with the latest developments with the concerns with ISMP? So that was mentioned earlier. ISMP is one of the experts in the space that people go to get, what's really going on, right? So they wrote an article, and just to clarify what the issue is. So dead space. For those of you not familiar, dead space exists in any syringe today, okay? It is, to my knowledge, something that's calibrated in any decent syringe. It's calibrated, meaning when you look at your graduations on the syringe, the graduations are the markings on the syringe, those markings take into account that fluid that's recognized here in the blue piece in the bottom, okay? And dead space is recognized to be part of the overall equation of what's being delivered, Does that make sense so far? Okay. So when you have the current system, this is the left side of the slide. When you have the current system, you have a male syringe that goes into a female tube. That's just like your feeding tubes today. It's a female open port. And that dead space enters in into that female port. The fluid is drawn up, it's administered, and the same amount that is drawn up is in the same amount that's delivered at the end, and you don't have an issue because you've delivered an accurate dose. However, when you go to the right, and I'm sorry this picture is a little bit small, when you go to the right and you see this is just imagine that's the barrel of a syringe, okay, that are the long pieces with the purple in them. On the left-hand side, on the left part of those two, that is the female part of the syringe now. So you've now adjusted the orientation opposite. You have the feeding tube that's going to be engaged, and that feeding tube now with ENFit has a male part in the pathway. Okay, when that pathway the female part goes in with the fluid in there, essentially that fluid has to go somewhere. That fluid essentially goes back into the syringe and then gets delivered. So you now have potential for over-delivery. And then that obviously depends on how it's administered. So in this case, it's administered via a tube. Okay? There's one way to solve this. All right? And again, I'm sharing this as almost a case study of how we are working collaboratively together on this. There's a protocol that GEDSA team pulled together. And basically it illustrates how one could solve this problem with the use of a simple draw-up device. They are commonly used in pharmacy today, whether that's a fill cap or that is a draw-up straw. We saw tons of fill caps. We were at CHOP yesterday, a number of us, doing some studies, and we saw these fill caps everywhere. Anyway, you use a fill cap with a syringe, and you engage that in step 1. And then when you disengage that in step 2, there's no fluid in that dead space area. Okay? Then you go to step 3. And I'm sorry, step 1 and 3 look similar, but now you're delivering the medication. And that you're re-engaging an ENFit. Now the tube you're engaging at that point. And then in step 4, when you've delivered the dose, you disconnect the syringe. There's no fluid in the dead space. So picture 2 and picture 4 look the same. Therefore, you delivered an accurate dose. Okay? So that's one way to solve it. We actually went to CHOP, and they held a summit similar to this. They invited clinicians from across the country that represented children's hospitals, adult hospitals across the country to talk about this particular issue. And what we heard loud and clear from them was, that's a nice protocol, but we don't see that fitting into our practice. They prefer to have one syringe, so not an oral tip syringe for oral administration and then separately an enteral syringe for enteral administration. They would like to see one. They do not want a new procedure to have to follow. They say there's enough procedures out there today that people don't follow. They don't want to have yet another one that they have to train on. They had challenges with communication between pharmacy and nursing because often a syringe is filled in the pharmacy and then delivered up to the floor. How often do pharmacists talk to the nurse on the floor? Sometimes, often, sometimes not at all, right? Depends. But you can't count on it. That was the message, right? And then we had to, of course, accommodate for route delivery changes. One day it might be oral, and the next day it might be enteral, and it may switch even within the day. So these are there's quite a bit of feedback. We distilled it down to this as kind of essential elements of how to solve this problem. So we're looking at dosing accuracy, and you pointed it out, with 2 ml delivery doses and under is where we're really focused on. We cut it off there because over 2 ml doses, we know we can deliver an accurate dose with an ENFit currently, the current configuration of ENFit, and be plus or minus 10%. So we're looking at 2 ml doses and under. We're looking at 3 ml syringes and less. Now this is going to be verified, but that is currently what we're looking at. And we're looking at 0.2 ml doses that should have accurate with the accuracy within plus or minus 10%. So looking at very, very small doses, 0.2 ml, and looking at it being accurate within plus or minus 10%. That's our hurdle, all right? The other design consideration is minimize recoil in either direction, okay? So these are some elements that we look as, and essentially, from many of the engineers in the room that represent the companies, these are design inputs, right? These are the things that they need to hear to say, if I know what the problem is and it's defined well, I can solve it. And that's really what happened. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that was, we had a lot of questions coming in from the web about that. I think it was a very clear explanation. Well, we have to get on to some other questions, too. We've had other questions coming in. It was a topic that was brought up this morning about disconnect issues and possibly pulling out the tubes. And the questions people have, anybody who used the old Christmas tree type thing, that was your point of least resistance, least strength. So if something snagged, that's where it came apart. And that was discussed this morning. I think if bring it up on the flip chart, questions we're getting is this ENFit connector going to be so secure that now the tubes are going to break or they're going to come out? And possibly, well, anybody manufacturing industry, I think that's a relevant question, is if the tube snags, what's going to break this time? Is it going to be the tube's going to come out? Is there some mechanism where it's just going to disconnect, which is what currently happens? Anybody would like to take that? Or we're going to leave that as an unanswered question for right.
Here, wait a minute.
Sorry. I remember hearing at the Oley conference this summer that it takes, I don't remember who told me this, but I feel like it was a manufacturer saying it takes at least 15.
It takes 50, well, if you have a hard bumper peg type tube, in other words, not a balloon inside, but the bumpers, it's about 15 psi of pressure, and it's not a quick snap. It's, you have to put your hand on, because I pull these tubes, and slowly pull it to compress the button to get it out. I think what people were concerned about was, is the tube going to break? In other words, are you going to break somewhere on the tube which doesn't have that strength, as opposed to right now the Christmas tree comes apart and it's a mess and you got to deal with cleaning it up, but it doesn't dislodge the tube.
Okay.
Tube dislodgement in and of itself is very rare on a quick snap. When we usually see tube dislodgement, it's the patient's lost weight and people keep pulling the tube up, or they've gained weight, which is where we're going. Nobody's adjusted the bumper, and it's that slow, steady pressure can take weeks, and the tube will migrate. The internal bumper on the tube migrates into the stomach, it migrates into the abdominal wall. But that was the question being brought up. We had a couple of people asking about where's going to be the point of least resistance if this thing gets caught.
Well, and so I would love to hear an answer from a manufacturer, but as a patient, a consumer, for the people that are watching from online or wherever, or if you watch this recorded someday, for myself, even forget about ENFit, just in general, I always pin my, while I'm feeding right now, I always pin my tube to a piece of clothing that I'm wearing. And like right now, I'm using a grip lock, so, which actually has an adhesive to my skin and an adhesive to my tube. So that, and because I have a dog who loves to run around with me, so that if it were to happen, I'd have several points of contact to absorb that before I could grab the tubing and say, okay, buddy, settle down. You know, so just a thought for people in general, if that's a concern of yours, because it was my first concern, there are ways that you can at least slow down that pull.
I think the concern was it was such a secure connection
Yeah.
that wasn't going to be what was going to come apart if something got caught and went. And we just, as again,
that I really do need to finish it, and I also want to get back to this question because there's an element of this design standard that people need to understand, and that is that manufacturers have flexibility within this standard to solve these problems. This example here is not just answering the question of dose accuracy, is an example of how you can work within the confines of the standard to address problems like this. So I do want to continue if you don't mind. Here's an example. Left-hand side is the control. It's the ENFit tip syringe. It's currently a female port. You're familiar with it. The new ENFit tip example here is actually, if you look closely, there's a green interlumen that is kind of filled with green fluid, that is a male part inside of a female. I kind of joked that it's kind of like a Bruce Jenner. right now, but it's one where we've essentially reversed the orientation, okay? We've created what was a female and turned it into a male, and the reason we did that is we wanted to reduce the amount of dead space, number one, and then we also wanted to ensure that that connector now fits, if you can imagine, fits inside of the male tube part. And when you do that, you now don't have anything that's constricting or getting in the way of that fluid path, and therefore you deliver a highly accurate dose. I will go fast, sorry. So we looked at different orientations, syringe tip up, syringe tip down. We looked at in terms of filling the device and then in terms of administering the device. Incidentally, this is not one company's design. Well, actually, it was one company's design. There was another company that brought a design. We looked at it together. We worked collaboratively. And for some patients, it may be not a big deal. But for manufacturers, it's an incredibly big deal to realize and recognize that manufacturers are working together to solve this problem together. So designs were brought into the equation. This one was identified as solving the problem most effectively. And the group felt that collectively that they could engage with this type of a design and move forward. And we tested it, and it's, sorry, the print's so small, but regardless of the orientation of filling or administration, it met all requirements in terms of dose accuracy, plus or minus 10%, even down to 0.2 ml, as well as addressing the issue of dead space, performance, and tolerance on graduated capacity. So that is really good. The next thing is actually what additional work are we doing? There is additional performance testing in progress. We did proof of concept, which is the data I just shared with you. We're now doing performance testing with a third-party review lab to conduct the testing over in the UK. They do all kinds of work for the NHS, which is the equivalent of the FDA over in England. We're doing a risk analysis and usability testing. Sorry, I borrowed this slide from the other day, but usability testing occurred earlier this week at the ASHP meeting with pharmacists, and we did testing with Nationwide Children's on Wednesday and CHOP on yesterday. Sorry, I'm losing track of my days. And several other testing to be conducted in the States as well as in Europe and other markets around the globe. So a lot of work going into this. The reason I bring this up, guys, is that this is a good example of how when we recognize a concern or a problem, the group has been able to work very effectively and collaboratively. When the problem is well defined, we can find a solution. In this example, it's a solution that falls within the confines of the standard, and it's compatible and consistent with the standard. And we're able to move forward with a highly accurate dose. Performance testing will prove out whether it's actually more accurate than even what's used today, certainly in places like the UK. I want to also go to a separate question, which was around the standard itself, okay? So the standard as it's defined today defines this part right here and in, okay? So it defines kind of the collar and the outer diameter of the collar, dimensions around the corner here, and then on inside even into the inner diameter. What it does not include is the stuff that's outside here, okay? Same on the other part. It defines this, it defines this, and the outer diameter and the inner diameter. It also defines this. What it does not define is anything past that point, right? So anything here, that's different. So I am kicking myself because I provided everybody with these wristlets. Everybody sees these wristlets and thinks it's a device. It is not a device. It's nothing more than a demonstration of how this connects with that. Okay? It's not a device. It's not intended to be used to do testing or anything along those lines. And the other thing that's really important is the manufacturer has to decide what they're going to do from this space here, as well as this space up there. Those are the things that can help solve some of the problems on dexterity, on misconnection. There are these things pulling apart, right? There's nothing that says that that piece can't be a little bit more flexible and actually pull out. These are things that are all possible within the standard. You haven't seen the devices yet. I need to underscore, you might have seen a couple of things from the Oley meetings and so forth, but there are lots of other examples of things you have not seen because manufacturers are holding them tight to the vest because they want to define and provide something that is unique and most acceptable for the marketplace in which they exist. Okay?
So this is Scott Colburn again from the FDA and convener. So the features that are the interface or the sealing surfaces to establish non-interconnectability or connectability need to follow those things. But that's the only part of the component that needs to follow that requirement. Everything else from there on out is the device. The threads itself, yeah, but well, a breakaway, yes. So this is a locking force function feature design. That is correct. So to that effect, now, well, you have to.
From the connector. In other words, upstream in the tubing of the
Yeah.
connector could break away. The connector itself isn't going to.
There could be that feature as well, but also remember the design or the threads that we'll just use the picture on the board is just an example of one type of design or thread. There are other designs that have threads that go all the way around like you'd see on a bottle cap. And then there's others that may be able to address those features that an engineer is working on right now. So again, these are the areas that define the dimensional analysis criteria to establish non-interconnectability. But because of maybe certain environments may need certain things, those things that's where the engineers say, all right, well, I can take this Fiat and I'm going to turn it into a limo and it's still going to meet that requirement that the Fiat asks for. This is almost a very similar thing, and that's why when you look at the lures today, and you look at the lure standard, you would think none of these are lures, but yet they all claim conformance to that standard, just as you will see with these as well. But the underlying principles of what will be required to establish non-interconnectability are the ones that must be honored. Now, again, manufacturers are creative, and they're going to do things that may address this issue if they feel that it is something that is of a desire or requirement for the device performance to reduce these types of adverse events.
Scott,
But real quick, though, Dave, before you finish. But again, going back to what we discussed in the other room, this type of connector has been in this application space with a variety of designs in multiple countries for about 15 years now. And this issue really hasn't come up yet. So while I think it's something that I guarantee every manufacturer in the room is listening to and going to assess, it has not shown to be an issue thus far in the hundreds of or millions and millions of products that have been established here in the U.S., not with the ENFit, but a very similar like design, as well as several other countries right now. Well, they have about 5 or 6 different designs right now, which is why they're having big problems with portability of care and people not being able to get care across different institutions. So that raises a whole different area of concern, which is why the manufacturers have tried to come together to alleviate that issue, which is just as much of a patient risk to not be able to deliver a therapy through a product. If you're a patient, you're going to Atlanta, but then you're going to Disney World next week, and you need to get supply or care. That ability to do that is an extremely important thing. There has been, I don't know how many issues that have been raised in the UK, but one of the things they came to us to say is don't do the same mistake we've done in this space by not trying to address bringing in a single solution. The reason why we don't see this issue in the vascular space is because everyone uses the lure. We don't have issues with portability of care, but we do have a historical fact that shows even when that happens in the vascular space, happened at an air show incident in Germany where there was 2 versions of the lure that showed up at an emergency setting. A lot of people died because they couldn't deliver medications. One country was putting in IVs, the other was trying to administer medication. They had a different version of the lure, and a lot of people died because of that. And that kind of went into this thought process of why a single solution has several advantages to try to reduce these type of deprivation adverse events. I don't think we're saying that. They are having a lot of issues. So the device systems in them of themselves work fine when worked well together. The downside is people are mobile, and and supply chains can't track where people need to go sometimes, and that's where if you show up at a hospital that doesn't have that type of supply, then the adverse event could occur if there's an emergent need to connect to that system. And that's why the clinical organizations that we had worked with, Aspen and Oley and ISMP and NSA, really said if you're going to do this, you really should be focusing from a standards perspective to offer one design within the standard. Now again, I anticipate here in the U.S. we're going to still have a dozen different manufacturers using proprietary connectors for whatever reason they feel is important. And there's no law to say that they can't. The law is really trying to demonstrate that they don't misconnect. But there is a driving force, and this is where the market really makes the deciding factor. The FDA is not pushing this. Even the California state law doesn't say it has to be this. They're just saying you can't misconnect across said applications. The market is the one that's really going to drive, are there going to be proprietary connectors or connectors that are not in the 80369 series? And I guarantee you there will be. But it is. Can you show me where the FDA has that written? Could I speak to your regulatory affairs department? Because I think I could address that question pretty easily, but that's not the case. There's several, every week there's another 510K that gets cleared that may not have this connector on it. There's a standard in place. There's the CN3 standard that's been in place, and we're not writing it as a law. It's a voluntary consensus standard. We could talk offline as a regulator to manufacturer on regulatory, what the regulators are trying to say what you need to do.
Okay,
that's a different thing.
If we can move on to some other questions. Fortunately, a lot of the questions we're getting from the web are being answered by the discussion. But one question came up, was not addressed this morning, and this would be a question to the manufacturers. Are there plans in progress that you can discuss about what happens if the actual ENFit connector cracks? Is this going to be repairable, or is the patient going to have to get a whole new tube? And I don't know if any of the manufacturers can even address this at this point, but this was brought up. So, okay, we don't have an answer to that one, apparently. Oh.
I'll take two. So it depends on the tube, right? So some of the tubes have Y ports that come out and can be replaced, like a PEG, for example. And then there are other balloon gastrostomies, some do, some don't, where that port is permanently attached to the tube. So that's a no different problem than we currently have, because ports rip off and tubes break, and so we deal with that now. So that's nothing new.
Some of the questions I know we're not going to have answers to, but
And I actually want to go back to your prior question, if you don't mind, about if it gets yanked on and pulled out, where's that path of least resistance? Again, my question would be, what do we do with infusion connectors, which are Luer lock? So it's no different than that situation. I don't have an answer. I'm just doing sort of a point.
I can tell you from 30 years of experience with PICC lines and not chem ports and stuff, the resistance point is always in the tubing. In other words, the tubing will snap. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing for the patient. They used to have patch kits for Hickman catheters, and I ran out a number of times. Patients would come into my office, and I'd get out the glue and everything and put their Hickmans back together, which we don't do because of infection rates now.
Right.
But I think the question was, if this is going to be put in so tightly that if it cracks, a flange breaks or something, that the patient has to get the tube replaced versus will it be repairable? I think that's something the manufacturers along the line may want to address. Is there going to be any availability to fix these things? Because these are long-term tubes. Once they're in, you don't want to have to change them if you can possibly change them. But I don't think we have an answer to that today. Yes? Okay.
So Don McMichael from Halligan Health. So we make a wide variety of tubes. And I will tell you today that in the longer-term tubes, the kind of implanted tubes, or the PEG tubes as we call them, the rigid bumper tubes, they're repairable today. Right? So you can put a different feeding adapter on, and move forward, right, without taking the tube out. That's going to be the same going forward, right? That will not change. Other tubes, like balloon tubes, today, if you break something on the head, you have to remove the tube and replace it. That'll be the same going forward in the future. So we don't really see a big difference in the way these tubes are used or the way they're repaired or replaced.
I think that answers the question. Obviously, for people who don't know, the reason you have to replace a balloon is normally when you break anything on the balloon, you've also broken the channel that inflates the balloon deflates, and it all comes out. We have another question about, and again, I'm asking this, I don't think we're going to have an answer, increased in cost of the syringes for bolus and such. In other words, if you have to go buy a whole new set of syringes with the ENFit connector to use them.
I actually I'm required to say something on this one, is that because of GEDSA as a nonprofit trade association, we are governed, as anybody is, on antitrust laws. And those laws are very clear in terms of what you can and cannot discuss. And we absolutely cannot discuss pricing or breaking up geographies or things of that nature. So I'm going to say, I preemptively want to say that I don't want any manufacturer commenting on price, okay? So it's just something we are obligated to do.
We're going to go one more question, and then we're going to have our lunch break. We've had several questions about the usability for the ENFit connectors in venting. And that was discussed this morning about whether or not it was possible. Some of the patients came up and discussed this morning their concerns about the ability to vent with the ENFit connector. And I'm going to ask if you could just reiterate what you said this morning about the issues with venting, Mary.
Generally, I vent through the G portion of my GJ tube. It was much easier with a hanging tube. I have a Mickey now. It's a little bit more difficult, but I still use the bolus feeding tube, attach it to my G portion, and then attach the feeding end to a Foley bag. Do you want me to get it out and show you on the camera? This is a leg Foley bag. This is the bolus feeding tube. I attach the end of the bolus feeding tube to my G port and attach the feeding end of it to the end of a Foley catheter. And that way it can drain from my stomach into the Foley catheter. If it gets full, I can just empty the catheter, close it, and keep going. There are times when I have to use this consistently. There are times when I only need to use it a couple of times a week. But this is a concern that will the ENFit be able to adapt to the Foley bag so that I can still vent through my G tube.
So this is, my name's Cynthia. I work in home care, and I actually see a lot of patients like yourself that use those Foley bags as a gravity drain system. So I think you have a very legitimate question, and I don't know, since that is not part of the ISO standard that's changing yet, I would imagine that the adapters that we currently use would solve that problem. For the transition adapters would solve that problem. So that's the good news.
percentage and turning it into low profile. We don't put a lot of low profile tubes in our facility. So most of our tubes, especially venting, are the larger tubes. So we now take those tubes and now require a ENFit on there. We do feel like venting will be affected by it.
I was just going to ask, how we, in a hospital environment with the suction pump, how would that work?
Suction, that's the thing, suction, or you're pushing the intronutrition through with a pump, or when you're sucking out. You won't see, I don't think, dramatic differences as far as flow dynamics because you're adding force. Okay? All of our home intronutrition patients go home and do gravity feeding. Okay, so they do gravity. We know the flow characteristics are different when you attach ENFit and do flow feed. We've done that. We have got an article that's in press that they then describing this. And so we know the flow characteristics are different. Now we talked about the syringes that we can serve. So all of our patients now will probably have to go to a syringe type feeding, and that will add cost. Whatever you want. That will add cost for our patients because there's not going to be without working.
Even to add to that, the other component is the amount of force it takes to then either suction or push.
Can you talk about the feedback?
Not only the flow change as we're going through the ENFit compared to our larger tube, but also the amount of force that it takes. Even if we're using syringe, is that better? So not only is the flow changed, but also the amount of force it takes. So let's say you are doing syringe feedings. Through the ENFit, it does require more force from our testing compared to our bigger bore, And so we think even if you're doing venting using suctioning, we'd like the manufacturers to kind of share the data of how much force difference is going to be required to do that as well.
So, Don McMichael again. Just to quickly talk to a couple of things in the room. First of all, we have done testing of our products, both force and gravity flow, various formulas. There are tubes that, when you get to the larger bore and specifically like a 24, 26, 28, 30 French type of balloon catheter, where an ENFit adapter will affect that flow. Right, it's obvious that the channel is smaller, and those bigger bore tubes, much bigger bore tubes, are susceptible to that. We talked about venting. The young lady is using a 22 French catheter that we make, and that 22 French tube, even though that sounds big, the lumen that goes down for gastric suctioning is the exact same diameter as the ENFit. Okay, so even on a tube that hangs out of a patient's body, right? If it's a 22 French catheter that Halyard manufactures, that lumen that goes all the way into the stomach for suctioning is the exact same diameter as the ENFit. Flow will not be affected either in suctioning or infusion in that regard. So I agree that manufacturers will do their own testing. We've done ours. Halyard is comfortable with the flow dynamics. We're able to get very good flow through all of our products. We have people using our products now in a variety of sizes for blenderized ice without significant issue.
So let me just respond to that. So obviously, we're at a clinic, and so we agree with the whole premise of having a safe connector, and so I think that everybody can agree on that. We've done, all we're doing is doing testing, and I can tell you, trying to get a prototype for testing was very difficult. But we got a prototype, and obviously it's not the finished product. And so, we tested with 24, 20, the low-profile connector set, which the standard was basically set to, basically saying, look, The low-profile connector set is about the same as the ENFit as far as diameters go, and so flow through that is going to be similar. But our venting tubes are 24 French venting, 20 to 24 French venting tubes. And so, again, the palliative care patients now are in a position where the flow will be affected through that. There's no doubt in anybody's mind as far as clinicians go. We know that low-profile connector sets clog more often than the larger bore tube. So all we're doing is trying to test, independent of industry, some of these theories, and we've done that, and some of it's gone through peer review process now. And so we're just trying to figure out what's the right answer. The big question I had for FDA is, let's say that it is shown that the larger bore tubes, like was mentioned, do probably clog at a higher rate when you vent through them, and I think that's going to be the case. Is there any avenue for industry to make venting specific tubes, from your opinion, as far as interpretation of the rules and regulations?
Please speak into the mic. We're getting.
So I can probably only give a gloss answer on that because I don't work in the pre-market office for that specific branch, and they have been involved when dealing with many of the manufacturers on some of these similar questions. The intended uses or indications for uses for products are you're really at the discretion. One, it follows the regulation and the product codes that they're assigned to, but the manufacturers assign their indications for use or their intended uses based upon how they design their products for that. So to your question, the answer could be yes. If that's an area where a device would need to have that indications for use for that specific purpose, and it makes sense. Yeah, I think the only concern from a clinician standpoint would be, is that in the best interest of public health to have a device that could be with that intended use, knowing that, especially in this space, that we do a lot more with these types of products than what's necessarily on the intended use. So, a lot of, alternative or secondary uses are applied that, frankly, we're learning. I think this group is learning about even, how the products are being used. And so that's where this information being collected is going to go into the design controls, the design realization of their products, because, we're learning more about, what's going beyond the instructions for use of a product based upon clinical environments and home use environment care. So that kind of goes in. So I think, I have to almost take a kicker from Tom's point of view, as although prototypes and, things are being put together to try to assess what they think will come out, it is mostly, and I'll tell you firsthand, seeing, 6 different ways to Sunday, there's the prototypes are not probably representing what's going to come out, because the manufacturer doesn't want to deliver something that the market's not going to want, because another manufacturer will, and then they're going to lose that slice of the market. No, we can call them dirty. They're all here to make money, right? Because they're going to make sure they give you something that you want to buy. And that's going to be the first and foremost. So I doubt you're going to see, they're not going to be designing things that won't work, because who's going to buy it?
Okay, we have 5 minutes. We've got one more question we've been getting from the feedback.
Yeah, I have one comment and one question. My comment is this: when Medtronic and Nvidia and BT distance themselves from ENFit, that makes me pay attention. My question is this: to what extent have adult meters been part of the testing, particularly those who use blenderized feeding?
We were asking about the blenderized feedings again, correct?
What?
I think we've discussed this before about the utility of blenderized feedings, whether or not they're going to go down. I think that's going to be variable on the consistency of the blenderized food, how finely that you're going to process it. There's a lot of issues on what you can and can't do with the blenderized tube feeds. And there's not going to be one answer for that. Excuse me. We will talk about it. I mean, because this goes into two more questions we've gotten, and they're related to one person sent in a question. The hospital has decided no more jury-rigged connections, which is a great idea. Do the manufacturers, excuse me, somebody must be wearing perfume in this room. Do the manufacturers have plans that you can discuss about possibly coming up with bags to vent the tubes into and all these other adapters if we can't sit there and start doing what you're doing, which is to take the urinary catheter? As such, hospitals are really wanting to get away. Mine is the same way. If it's not specifically designed for that use, forget that it works. They don't want to be in a position of using it anymore. And another question we had from Dr. Klang is some of the syringes now made with the Luer lock connectors are no longer being allowed to store drugs. They're not suitable for it. Will the ENFit syringes going with standard where patients could pull up medications and such and store them to carry to do later, or it's not going to be suitable for storing drugs? Again, you may not be able to answer these. I don't think we have an answer.
Okay, so I think we should break for lunch. This is a good time. And for the folks viewing via the web, we'll be back this afternoon, 45 minutes to have our lunch. And we promise to tackle blenderized diets. All right, thank you.